Ooh, that's a good sign. Awesome.
Asked Stephen to be quiet. Gonna have to write away him, not
There we go. I knew they were going to get here.
I think we'll get started. You ready?
Yeah. Oops.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tony Bates. I'm Research Associate at Contact North and moderator for this session. Thank you very much for coming, and congratulations on finding the room. Could you please switch off your cell phones or mute them? It's my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Downes. You've got his bio in the pamphlet. All I need to say is that he's the most original thinker about online learning, not just in Canada, but worldwide. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Tony. Hello, world. So yeah, just so that you know, I am attempting to live stream this. Just so you know, it is being video recorded, so anything you say will be used against you sometime in the future, especially as you're launching your political careers. So keep that in mind. So now the video, okay, it's just me. I'm sorry, online video people, and the slides aren't posted yet, so we'll have to make do. I was still doing slides just before the session, so this is a bit of a work in progress. So it's a bit loose around the edges, but I think we can live with that. Clicker. They said there was a clicker. Here we go. Forward, backward. The markings are black on black. For someone like me with eyes like pain. All right, I got it. I'm good, but thank you. All right, so Maxine asked me to do this presentation and drew up the abstract for me. Well, not this abstract, but the outline that you read in the guide. So it's kind of an interesting thing. It was a bit of a, it's a bit of a stretch from what I usually do. Not in the sense that I talk about personal learning, because I do talk about personal learning quite a bit, but in the sense of practical applications to make this actually doable for people. But I am going to focus on some of that later on in the talk. I've got some interesting examples, but I have a bunch of observations and I want to set this all up first. So basically we're divided into three sections. First section, I'm going to talk a bit about personalized learning, properly so called, and then some of the educational theory around some alternatives. I'll try not to linger too long on that, but I do need to get that in as background. Then I'm going to talk about the distinction that I make specifically between personal and personalized learning. If you've watched me before, you've seen this bit, but I've tried to bring in some new resources and perspectives. And then finally, the section about how do we actually make this happen? What are the tools, resources, etc. It's not going to be a tools talk, so don't worry about that, although yes, there are some screenshots of tools, but not many. How's that sound? All right, nobody's leaving yet. Remember, this is one of my talks. One of the benefits of my talks is you can always leave. People like that about my talks. All right. I want to do a wee bit of background first. background because I was marveling at, I'm walking around downtown Toronto and Bay Street and all the people in suits. And just a couple of days before, I was there in a barn walking through manure. And I thought, I think I feel more comfortable there. I always ask, how do I know that I'm right? What's the evidence for my view? So I want to tell you, first of all, don't just sit there and trust me. Take everything I have with a grain of salt. Do your own thinking, do your own research. These are just my ideas based on how I learn and based on the experiences that I've had over my career as a learning technologist and researcher. And how I learn is personal learning. And I was thinking of doing a whole thing, I didn't do the slides for it, but a whole thing of how I learned to bicycle. Because when I say how I learn, everybody says to me, well, yeah, but you've got a good memory, you can learn whatever you want, right? But bicycling, who pictures me as an athlete? Now I ask you, right? But I did learn cycling, and I maintain my own bicycle for the most part. There's one who's leaving. Good stuff. I maintain my own bicycle. I do long distance cycling. I did about 2,200 kilometers this year. I think that's success. And I think that's an example of personal learning. And it's that kind of success that I refer back to a lot of the time when I'm talking about learning. What is my evidence? I'm always asking that. It's interesting, and in a conference like this, you get different kinds of requests for evidence from different people. I was taken aback yesterday. Someone from government asked me if I knew about successful programs that implemented what I'm talking about. I thought, programs? I don't even think of programs, right? But business people like cases, government people like programs, economists like test results, scientists like experimental results, computer scientists like stuff that works, but the only people who really matter about results and evidence for results are students, learners, and we don't trust them to say whether it works. So I'm sort of puzzled by that, but it's one of the things that I think about. Who am I talking to? Again, in this conference, and I noticed that during the presentation of the research survey yesterday, you told me you were moderating that, also with the people from the corporate side, mostly we're talking about people who are in the educational system or people who are in big companies. My people are there, all right? My people are the ones that are not in the education system. They're, to me, the ones that matter. I know you're all educators, you're focused on the client, right? You're focused on business needs and all of that. But really, if we're looking at how to make this stuff work, it's easy if you have a captive audience that's paid a ton of money. There was a presentation the other day, Paul Hunter talking about his business school, and said we have a 92% retention rate as compared to MOOCs, which have an 8% retention rate. And I'm thinking there, well, yeah, how much did they pay for that course? Right? They may have paid $10,000 for that course, and they're an executive in a company. So yeah, it's not like, if you take these guys and take them to your business course, well, you still have 92% retention rate. It's easy to work with audiences who've paid for the privilege of learning, but really, if we want to have an impact, we need to be looking at that wider audience. And so I have a different view, I think, on what counts as success. My view of success isn't test results. I think that's silly. My view of success, and I had a discussion about this, isn't employability, isn't meeting the demands of the workforce. Because from the perspective of the learner, there's a need to meet a demand of a workforce to get a job, but usually they have a much wider range of goals and aspirations in life than just meeting the demands of their next employer. And so, again, my view of success is wider. All right, that's the preliminary. I need to be careful not to make the whole talk the preliminary. I am prone to doing that. Black on black. Usability matters, folks. It matters. All right. See what I mean? Oh, now I've broken it. All right, so the concept of personalized learning. You've heard tons about personalized learning over the last few years, I'm sure. Personalized learning has its history in what we call recommender systems. My first experience with a recommender system was back in 1998. It was a system called Firefly. You answered questions about what kind of music you liked and things like that, and then it gave you recommendations, right? Microsoft bought it and then killed it. But it was really interesting. The core idea of recommender systems is, what do people like you themselves report liking? Or what do people like you themselves use, right? So you have the basis, right? People like you, what they do, here's you who are like them, so you will probably like what they like. It's a very simple matching sort of problem. Now, it can get complex. You get student information, you get requirement information, you munge it all in the student database, but it's still the same idea. So a lot of personalized learning really boils down to being recommender systems. I'm not really thrilled by that. I have never thought of learning as a recommendation problem. I've never felt that, oh, you just take the right resources and put them in front of people and the learning happens. I've never thought that was enough. So the next step, and we're seeing this a lot in a lot of contemporary systems and a lot of papers that are coming out even now. This is from something called Bit9 Global. I know nothing about them, but they did do this thing on personalized learning path recommendation. I remember my colleague Guillaume Durand was very interested in that. We did a paper a few years ago on that. Learning path, right? So you have a bunch of different topic modules or whatever, and the learning path recommendation will give you a path through it. I think of it as kind of like providing a guided tour of a city. And there's nothing wrong with a guided tour of a city unless you don't want a guided tour of a city. When I go to a city, I like to explore, follow my nose, if you will, look for good restaurants, bars, whatever. And those usually aren't on the tour. So now, even more recently, we have adaptive learning. And adaptive learning is a bit more involved. It's still using a lot of the same underlying technologies, recommender systems, but the concept of adaptive learning is that the system will learn something about you, maybe from your history, maybe your actual work that you're doing, maybe a pre-test, whatever, and then based on that, and based on generally machine learning algorithms that have worked on a big pile of previous data, it will make recommendations for you. Again, we're still recommending resources, but we're just getting more fine-grained in our recommendations. And you know, it might, by resources, I mean that pretty broadly. It might be activities, it might be events, it might be people to talk to. But nonetheless, it's still at its core a recommender system. And it's still at its core depends on finding people like you who want to do things like this. All of these systems depend on that. And it doesn't matter what the algorithm is, ultimately it comes down to people like you who want to do things like this. So the question is, who are people like you? And that's going to make a big difference. See, you have to click the down arrow to go forward. Right? And like, okay, I can see the thinking, right? Okay, up is the top, down is, but anyhow. So, as with all cases of big data, machine learning, etc., what really matters, what really makes this work is the data. And here's a very technical presentation of what I've just been saying, right? People like you, the sample data and the expected result, right? And then the new data, that's you, and then you use the model to produce the result. The model, properly so called, is how the machine learning system settles after you've given it a whole pile of data. And you can build the model in different ways using different algorithms, but ultimately that's how it works. And we could talk about that, but I won't talk about that because my eyes will glaze over, your eyes will glaze over. All right. So this has been implemented in a variety of learning tools, not all of which have been successful. In fact, from my perspective, most of which have not been successful, and I listed a few of them just for fun. Newton, Alt School, In Bloom, and Arizona State University. Now, Arizona State University is still reasonably successful. The first three, I think, are generally regarded as failures. They've pivoted, they've tried to do different things. Alt School, I think, got its funding pulled. In Bloom was shut down because of data privacy, etc. But again, you know, this is from Newton, right? So this is a learn about Pythagorean theorem lesson. It's trying to give you feedback. Are you on track, struggling, etc. It's, how do I want to put it? On the student end, it comes out as recommender systems. On the teacher end, it's kind of like a recommender system too, but of a different sort, right? So we have what we call predictive analytics. It's doing the same thing. What do people like you do or want or whatever, except in this case is what is the expected outcome, educational outcome of people like you. So it looks at previous people. This person looks like you and they failed. So you were probably going to fail, except they don't, the systems don't tell you that, which would be useful. They tell your teacher that, and then the teacher applies some kind of remediation. It's all very impersonal, it's all very analytical, and I think for the most part it's all very wrong. And it's wrong for a variety of reasons. But let me get to the more common criticisms first. First of all, there's the criticism that it's ineffective. And there are different ways it can be ineffective. My favorite way it can be ineffective is that it can be easily gamed. If you know how personalized learning systems work, and especially how they collect their data, then you feed the system the data that it wants, and you progress through your course very rapidly, not having accomplished anything educational. That's how I completed a complete course in, what was it, unconscious bias in about 15 minutes at NRC. Now, the fact that I had to take a course in unconscious bias after having taught that subject for a number of years, I didn't take that to account. I just did the things. There's the complaint that it depersonalizes training. A lot of people talk about the human touch. A lot of people talk about these systems can't do in a classroom what a human can do. I think that they will. And I don't think that's the danger. I think we will come to love our AI friends. That's a prediction. I don't think the problem is that it's depersonalized. You know, even now, people are developing attachments to, well, maybe not Siri, because nobody loves Siri, but OK Google, things like that, which are really becoming pretty interactive and pretty useful. The third major criticism is, and this is fairly significant, personalized learning systems depend on surveillance and violate personal privacy. And it's a bit of a conundrum, right? And especially for you guys in the educational system, you're dealing with these systems. The only data available to these systems is the data in the learning management system, or maybe the learning record store, which is gathering data from other applications. And that's it. So it's actually a fairly narrow slice of data, and therefore a fairly unrepresentative slice of data, but that's what you're allowed to get. To really make this work, you'd have to gather wide data. You'd have to gather data about a person's Twitter account, what they post on Facebook, what they blog, the TikTok videos they made. Did they pronounce Martha Dumptruck properly? Things like that. But that would be a gross invasion of privacy. And of course, the wider you cast your net, the more there is a danger that this data could be in one way or another unrepresentative of you. TikTok Steve isn't the same as Learning Steve, and that's probably the same for all of you. Okay, so what are the alternatives? What do we do instead? Well, in the history of distance learning, as Tony will tell us, we've had alternative perspectives on a lot of this. One of them is the principle of adult learning, or andragogy. Pretend there's an image there that succinctly explains andragogy. Andragogy, that's a slide I didn't get done, I'm sorry. Sometimes these things are assembled on the fly. It's the only way to do it, but sometimes. But andragogy, I keep pronouncing that word, is essentially the science of adult learning, as opposed to pedagogy, which is the science of child learning, right? Now, when you begin to work in a distance learning institution, as I did at Athabasca University, they emphasize that adult learners aren't the same as younger learners. They have a lot of experience, a lot of background. They have their own definite ideas about how they want to learn, what they want to learn for, their learning objectives, etc. And so when we're offering programs for adult learners, we have to take this in mind and not spoon feed them. Who was it that said that? There was one of the presentations that I saw the other day, like yesterday. I have a great memory, but it's unfortunately short. All of my memory is short-term memory. It was the presentation about the Gen Z learners. And leave aside whether or not we can characterize learners according to their age, even in general. Nonetheless, lots of parts of that rang true, and they rang true as much for me as they would probably for the Gen Z learner. And one of the things was, they don't want to be spoon-fed. They don't want to be given. It was the other presentation about executive learning. Treat executives like executives was the slogan. And when I'm listening to that, I was thinking, treat farmers like executives. I thought that would be pretty cool. But the idea was, don't give people meaningless, true-false kinds of assessments because they don't see the world that way. The world is complex, the world is fuzzy, the world is gray. I think that would also apply to the Gen Z learners as well, now that I think of it. Moving from andragogy, we have something called hotagogy now, and that's courtesy of Stuart Hayes and colleagues. I'm not a fan of that word, but I'm a fan of the concept. And the idea here is self-determined learning. It's a bit different from andragogy and pedagogy because typically in a learning environment, we will determine what the learning outcome should be, right? We're the course designers. We write the learning outcomes, and the learners are in the course in order to achieve those. But in hotagogy, That's not going to be the case. In pedagogy, we're dealing with probably mature learners, or at least learners who have been taught sometime previously in their life how to learn, and now they're determining their own learning. So, some of the principles: learning when the learner is ready, requiring the learner to move beyond learning, and reflect on their learning more, reflect on how they learn, reflect on their background, beliefs, and actions. So it's not just immediate knowledge-oriented learning, it's learning about how they learn. It's learning that does not depend solely on the teacher and is often not even initiated by the teacher. It's someone going out and deciding on their own, I'm going to learn how to change a spoke in a tire, and then doing that. And it's focused on what the student wants, what the student needs in a given circumstance, as opposed to on a syllabus. That's the quick 5-cent outline of pedagogy. There's quite a bit of literature on that, and a number of studies on that. So that forms some of the background. More recently, especially over in the corporate learning world, people talked about informal learning a lot. What do they call it? The 70-20-10 model. My old friend Jay Cross was a champion of this. I've reduced some of the major types of informal learning to slogan forms here: implicit learning, reactive learning, deliberative learning. But for me, the essence of informal learning has always been that it is less content-focused and more action-focused. It's less about acquiring a body of knowledge and more about, if you will, performance support, or even ambient or occasional, or as the chart says, implicit learning in the workplace. Most of what we learn is in fact informal learning. All of you learned to tie your shoes. Probably none of you learned it in school. Although when I was young, they made diligent efforts to teach that to me and failed utterly. To this day, I have issues with my shoes, which is why no laces. But if you think of most of the things that you do on a day-to-day basis, certainly all of your hobbies and avocations, etc., you've probably learned informally. There's a lot about how this happens, how informal learning is created out of informal learning networks in the workplace, etc. The main thing here is it's a contrast to the programmed type of learning that we looked at in personalized learning. There's a different perspective on learning. So we kind of set up some of the distinctions that I'm going to draw in this next section, which is why we have a blank slide. That was planned. No, it really wasn't planned. So, those of you who have listened to some of my talks before may have seen this chart. This chart is basically the capsule distinction between personal and personalized learning. People often ask me, okay, well, can you just give it to me in an intuitive way? Well, it's kind of like, a customized car or a custom car. Customized car, you take a Ford off the line, right? And then you give it some racing stripes, some fuzzy dice, leather steering wheel, white walls, right? It's been customized. But it's still an assembly line Ford, right? A custom car, they build it for you from scratch. Or even better, you build it, right? It's like, what's his name, Titus, with his hot rod, building his hot rods or whatever. Now, I'm a proponent of personal learning as opposed to personalized learning. People ask me, well, isn't there room for both? And it's like, yeah, there is room for both. It's like there's room for chocolate cookies and chocolatized cookies. And I know there's a market for chocolatized. It's cheaper, it uses carob, and kids can't tell the difference. Sorry, I just made that up. But there is a market for it. But really, if you want the genuine thing, you want chocolate cookies. If you want the best car, you want a custom car. But historically, it's been really expensive and really impractical to do. One of the great things about technology, at least to my mind, is we're now able to do a lot of that. So I've usually defined it just in this way, and then I've worked through this chart and people's eyes glaze over. So let me try it a wee bit differently with this talk. Down for 4. Okay, so one of the places where it really differs is in starting points. What are the objectives of the learning event? And you guys have all seen this. This is Bloom's taxonomy, right? And it's just as one part of Bloom's taxonomy. And the idea here is that you are describing your learning objectives using this taxonomy, and it helps you create a list of verbs that will describe your learning outcomes. Any of you who have done instructional design have probably seen this. So, you'll state your objective as, paraphrase something about, paraphrase A Tale of Two Cities, or estimate the height of the Eiffel Tower, or critique a presentation, that kind of stuff. And when learning is defined that way, when learning is defined as, if you will, the educational outcome, or the educational objective, defined cognitively or even effectively, then when you assess that, you're assessing it in terms of a gap. The objective defines an ideal state of knowledge that the person is expected to achieve, and then when you go through the learning process, you identify the gap between what they know and what they should know, and then that's where your personalized system typically kicks in and provides more content to fill that gap. Now, the alternative to that, and I actually draw my inspiration from the world of software in this, and the world of agile development. And in the world of agile development, it works exactly the opposite way. You don't try to learn something first, go through some assessment and find a gap. More, what you do is you try to build something or create something as simply as possible, then measure it in terms of, does it do what you wanted to? Is it making the customer happy? Are there things that could make it better? And then you learn from that outcome, and then you go through that process again. So in this methodology, you're focused on doing something. The doing something rather than the body of knowledge is what defines the goal of learning. So it's similar to the distinction that I drew earlier between informal learning and the more formal modes of learning, where the formal modes of learning are based on content. Informal learning is based on performance support, getting things done, etc. Another way I think that it differs quite a bit, and this is especially in terms of the design of learning. I think in these terms, not just of design of learning, but in the design of software and design generally, as satisfying requirements versus providing affordances. Typically, and again, in the software design process, we see this a lot, what we're trying to do is satisfy user stories or use cases. Right? These are similar to the educational objectives that we might be trying to satisfy with learning technology. But alternatively, when designing software, and certainly when I design software or anything for that matter, I'm not worried about satisfying particular use cases. And in fact, I find a particular use case is going to draw me toward a specific outcome and probably break the functionality of what I was trying to build. Instead, I'm looking at affordances. I'm looking at what kind of action does this thing make possible? And so the sort of software that I'm looking at is software that is open-ended, doesn't actually satisfy a particular use case. Now, if you think about it, take yourself back to the 1990s or the 1980s and think about when designers were trying to build typewriters on computers, right? Now, how would you approach such a task? Well, if you used use cases, you'd be building a letter writer or a note to grandma writer or a, etc. But really what we wanted is something pretty open-ended so that we could type anything that we wanted, where we weren't going to look at specific cases of typing this thing or that thing. And in fact, if we could, we'd do even more than just typing and printing something with these things. We could use them for, say, editing in place or sharing online, etc. All of that going way beyond the original use case of, say, typing a report or a letter to grandma, etc. So I prefer affordances. The assessment of learning, I want to draw the distinction here, and it's a distinction that I still struggle with a bit, but I think it's important. This diagram represents, I think, as the little thing says, learning as a cognitive phenomenon. The idea of learning as remembering, right? And people always go back to that. And then they give you theories about how memory works, and this is your working memory and your core knowledge and long-term memory, which frankly I consider all this to be a black box. And if I'm completely honest, made up, but don't tell anyone I said that. I don't think that this is actually how it works, because I don't think the human brain is a computer, at least not in that sense. I don't think we have quote unquote working memory or core knowledge. I think that we go back to evidence, right? We go back to the processes of figuring out how this stuff works. And back there they've decided, I'm going to look for evidence of short-term memory, and then lo and behold, they find short-term memory. If it hadn't occurred to them to look for short-term memory, I'm wondering whether they would have found it. I think this theory can be questioned. Of course, the question is, well, what's the alternative? And it looks something like that. And okay, now that's just a mess, and none of those things actually mean anything, even though they have labels. But the point that I'm making here is, when you actually look at human memory systems, that is brains, they don't have buffers for the most part, they don't have short-term memory areas, etc. They have networks, they have strengths of associations, connections. The things that they do are categorization, recognizing, those sorts of functions. The sort of functions, interestingly, that machine learning functions do. And it's the same kind of process. I won't say the same kind of technology, because of course one's squishy, the other isn't, which is a big difference. And there's a lot of differences in the implementation. But nonetheless, when we're building artificial intelligence systems that we want to learn, we're not building these, we're building these. And so the same sort of strengths and weaknesses that accompany our personalized learning tools also accompany these. And we're not going to make we're not going to make individual learning better by attending to this, because this isn't how it works. This is how it works. Does that make sense? Okay. And that leads us to questions of assessment, right? If we're using this model, then the question of whether somebody has become a physicist is answered by the question, do they know a certain body of knowledge? But if this is what it takes to become a physicist, if this is how the knowledge of being a physicist is structured, then really we're asking questions like, do they see the world the way physicists do? Do they ask the same sorts of questions? Do they use words the same way? Do they accept the same sort of thing as other physicists for their beliefs? Can they do the things that physicists can do? Frankly, I don't know what a physicist can do. Have they actually done any physics and shared their results? And most importantly of all, would other physicists recognize them as physicists? You see, it's the difference here between learning qua remembering qua having a certain body of knowledge versus learning as personal development, as forming all of these associations in your mind, as actually becoming physically a physicist. Next slide. Also intentionally blank. You know what that means. It means somebody's phone is talking to me. All right. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, everything I've said is true. Probably a lot of you have doubts, and that's fine. I'm not going to convince you in 47 minutes of talking. Has it been 47 minutes? No, it hasn't. It's been close, but not quite. All right, how do we make it work? We have an education system, both in companies and in universities, completely dedicated to this pretty much cognitive model of learning as remembering. And that's why we have page turners as courses. There was an instructional design session in here before I came in. It's like they were talking about page turners and working with subject matter experts and all of that. How do we make it work? Well, way back in 1998, I talked about something called the Triad Model. I also referred to something called the Online Host Provider Framework, which is the same thing. I got that from somewhere. This is not me coming up with this. But for the life of me, I can't find it anymore. But that was the phrase, the Online Host Provider Framework. It was a thing, it existed, that I referred back to in 1998, but I no longer have that reference. But it postulates three major parts of the educational system. The education provider, subject matter experts and assessment systems or services, etc. The learner, and then the third element, which was the host, right? So you have a host provider framework. The host is local to the learner. It's an online host provider framework. So the actual subject matter expert would be somewhere off in the distance, perhaps. And the role of the host was to provide advocacy for the learner, coaching and support. And the learner would be in their own community, in a community of their peers where they feel comfortable. And it's sort of drifted off. And again, I tried finding references to this, and the only reference I could find is my 1998 paper. But I know for sure that this has been repeated throughout the world of distance education, throughout the world of online learning. They just don't call it that. Well, that's fine. I was at a presentation yesterday, a collaborative project between the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association of Alberta, Athabasca University's Become project. It's providing pretty tough learning, statistics and all that stuff associated with a Bachelor of Commerce for Indigenous students in northern Alberta. They're using something like the Triad framework. They had an instructional team, which included the professor who came from Cameroon, which I thought was pretty interesting, although he was teaching out of Canada. And then in the community, an Indigenous mentor who worked directly with the students. And the idea here is that they created in that community a psychologically safe environment where the way they lived was the norm as opposed to the way people live on Bay Street or whatever. An off-site location where they could come together and create this learning community themselves. And that sort of thing seems to be working. And it brought back for me memories of working on something called the Sunrise Project in northern Alberta, in Slave Lake, where again, it was very much the same sort of thing. I was the subject matter expert, and then they had a lot of local support and a local environment where the students learned. And I would every once in a while drive up to Slave Lake and work with them in person. Community learning centers are a major part of this model. And they're all over, we just don't recognize them as such. Shopify in Ottawa, this is their, I think it's the 5th floor. They have 2 of them. There's one on the 6th floor and one on the 5th floor. These sort of learning spaces. There's a nice coffee bar. They have places for presentations. And what they do is they open their doors and they invite people in. They use Google Meetings. They used to use Meetup, but they stopped using Meetup for some reason. And now they use Google Events. And they advertise these meetings, and people from the community can come into Shopify. And I went to a bunch of them last year. It was all the people in Ottawa who were interested in graph technology. Where am I going to find people interested in graph technology? Certainly there weren't any classes on that or courses, and even then it wouldn't really be practical for me. But this learning event was perfect. In an offhand remark in a presentation, the Desire to Learn presentation the other day, one of the panel members referred to the Working and Learning store at Staples. Now, it's just down the road on University Avenue, just a wee bit south of Dundas. So I walked up there yesterday, took some photos, took a look around. They gave me a nice guided tour. It was all very nice. It's like you can become a member of this, or you can use the services on a day-by-day rate. You can rent meeting rooms and all of that, but it's working and learning. So they provide learning resources. They have ongoing events, and again, the idea is to actually make this learning and this working space accessible to the community. And I went in there, and there were people using it. There was a nice coffee bar. Coffee seems to be a common thing in these sort of places. But they have a nice coffee bar, and I had a little energy thing because of food. And there were people having a meeting, there were people doing a presentation, and lots of people gathered around the print shop that they had, and so on. So, that's not online learning, and I know that. But, people live and work somewhere. Everyone lives and works somewhere. And so, we think about online learning, we think about getting the course design right. I've always thought of online learning as getting the learning to the place where people are right. Way back in 2001, I did a talk in Australia, and before the talk, I went and visited a ship called the Tribal Warrior. And basically it was an Aboriginal project. It was an actual ship, and they got Aboriginal youth onto the ship, and they sailed up and down the coast of Australia doing outreach and tours and things. And they made it work because they used the internet and distance learning services to provide education for the youth who were on the ship doing this great living and working experience. That's the sort of thing that I think about when I think about personal learning. It works, a lot of this works because of things like multidisciplinary teams and people working in places where there are people doing many different things. There's a recent paper came out from, and I never know how to pronounce it, CEDEFOP. It's a big European research agency talking about this, and a number of the sections headings are taken from that, including this diagram by Paul Downs. What a great name. Just how bringing people from different backgrounds and different experiences together in these kind of areas, as opposed to 15 economists in a classroom in a Midwestern university, changes the whole nature of learning. And Downs outlines some of the things: prevents individuals from falling through the net, strengthens the role of families, overcomes the fragmentation of services, etc., etc. A lot of the barriers, a lot of the walls between silos that we have today in our institutions are overcome by these, work environments where there are multiple people from multiple domains working. And of course, people get picky about the terminology. So you have multidisciplinary, where you have two or more subject areas, to shared, to interdisciplinary teams from multiple subject areas. Looking around at this, I saw this a lot. There's a lot of studies online from the areas of medical education and engineering education. And that kind of makes sense, because people working in a hospital or people working on a construction project are working in these multidisciplinary environments, right? You have anesthesiologists and surgeons and nurses and whoever holds up the light. I don't know anything about medicine. But you have all of these people involved, so it makes sense to have all of these people involved in the learning, and it makes sense to have the learners in an environment where all of these people are. But all of that's not enough. There's always a big element of outreach and advocacy in these programs. I've seen that myself with MOOCs. Again, we go back to the 8% completion rate. I don't have an 8% completion rate in my MOOCs. I don't know what it is because I don't measure for that. But I do notice I have more people at the end than I had at the start. I don't even know what that is as a completion rate. But what I do with my MOOCs is that I do the outreach. I send a daily email newsletter. I send stuff on Twitter. I tweet, etc. I used to use Facebook. I don't anymore because evil. Social network services and things like that. Paul Hunter, when he's talking about his program, even executives need outreach. Who knew? So he talked about different types of nudges. Now, I saw some literature recently saying nudges have no impact on educational outcomes. Well, what counts as data? Maybe they make no impact on test scores, but for an executive it might kind of matter. So he identified, knowledge nudges, empathy nudges, reminder nudges. Brian Alexander has a weekly online video or webcast. The only time I ever go to it is when I receive a reminder email about 15 minutes before it starts, because I just don't have a good enough memory to remember to go to watch this session, etc. Here's an example. Here's an example of my outreach. When I was thinking, there's a program that NRC has that I learned about yesterday. I've been with NRC almost 20 years. I learned about it. There's a big program. I learned about it yesterday. So it occurred to me that a company the size of NRC should have its own daily newspaper. And that's probably true of, I know newspapers aren't really a good business model anymore, but they're a good information model. It's not about, reading the whole thing or even any of the things, but it's about having that information available to you. I could spend a whole talk on that. Advocacy, hugely important. I mentioned the BCOM project. The advocacy role, to my mind, seems to be the critical element to making something like that work. But also things like intergenerational learning. This is the NRC program that I was talking about. NRC's IRAP works with companies that have research needs. What IRAP does is it goes out, finds students who might be good in that area and matches them up with the company and then subsidizes their salary. What a great program. Why didn't we have a newspaper in NRC to tell us about it? So I could have talked about it sometime before my 20th year with the organization. But this all falls under the heading of working out loud generally, and that's what I do. I work out loud. Here's a Google Docs document of this talk in preparation. I got comments from people. Here's the open broadcasting system that's running on this computer here, live webcasting this. And the idea here is not just to create learning in the form of knowledge, but to create learning in the form of networks, of associations, of people working together. So, what is success? There's different definitions of success, but if you look at the ways of making people cooperate, supporting individual learning from multiple providers, having them able to do what they want to do ultimately is my bottom line definition of success. I know I'm really running out of time. Tony's being so patient. And he said, I'm not going to moderate you, but he's about to moderate me. I've worked for a long time on personal learning environments, and we have universities who have been doing open learning for many years, but as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this stuff is really expensive. And what the new technology does for us is it makes it a lot less expensive. I'm running a live video broadcast available around the world off of my computer that I set up in about 10 minutes prior to this talk. We couldn't do that 20 years ago. It just was not possible. Now we can do that, and we should. Another blank slide that I didn't finish. And another one with cases. There are some cases in the notes. Concluding remark. I just have one concluding remark. Because one of the things people talk to me about, they say, how can educational institutions survive in a world where learning is open, you're just providing resources and expertise and mentoring on all of that stuff, but you're not charging tuition, you're not doing executive MBAs. Sorry, Stephen, if you're in the room. How can educational institutions survive? And I was actually at Athabasca University 2 weeks ago. We had that conversation, and my answer was, well, look at roads, right? We spend billions of dollars on roads every year. Nobody expects them to make money, right? There isn't a tuition fee to use the roads. So the question is, how can we make education systems like roads? Well, what do roads do that education systems not always do? Roads take you to where you want to go. And so if you want to be indispensable as an education system and receive guaranteed funding from government without having to have tuition fees, take people to where they want to go. That's my talk.
Thank you, Stephen. Time for quick questions. You can stay on and miss your lunch if you want to stay longer. But any questions for Stephen before we go off to lunch?
I'm overruled by lunch, I get it.
There's a lot of cognitive processing going on, Stephen, I think.
And what's the definition of success for this talk for me isn't, did you remember it or anything like that, because you won't. No, you won't. But, did it change what you're thinking about? Has your perception on some of this stuff been altered slightly? Have you questions that you're walking away with? That would be success for me.
Hello, my name is Marion Reed. I introduced myself to you yesterday. I'm interested in almost everything that you said, but the most important part is, as a personal learner myself, what, other than Shopify and other than the recent one at the Staples, what are some more examples of how people interested in personal learning should seek out ways to become parts of learning communities?
So online, you probably want to find communities related to what you're doing. It's funny that educators always talk about building these communities. These communities exist. I know it's heretical for me to say this, but look at YouTube. You can learn literally anything in YouTube, anything. But more to the point, it also taps you into the community of people who are interested in that subject, because they'll all have, many of them will have their own website, many of them will tweet on Twitter, etc. And so you can kind of tap into that community. Just in terms of in your community around you, Meetup provides a valuable service. Now, if you're in a small community, it doesn't, because there aren't enough people to meet up. But if you're in a large city, there's probably some sort of meetup thing, maybe related to what you're doing. Bit hit and miss. There aren't nearly enough good examples of this sort of thing. So I don't have a whole wealth of examples for you. And they manifest differently everywhere. But basically, it's like I like to say, once you know what to look for, you'll find it. If you don't know what you're looking for, you won't necessarily find it. But now, if you're looking for this thing, you're going to see examples of it now. I hope. No, you will. I know you will.
Any more questions? Well, thank you, Stephen.
Oh, Rory is complaining in the back there.
You don't need a microphone, do you?
Yeah, Rory with us University. Stephen, at the beginning, you talked about what is success. You had that on there.
Yeah.
And you told us what is not success. And you didn't agree, but you didn't tell us what you think is success.
For me, success for a learning organization generally is, did the person who used their services do what they wanted to do? That's the bottom line. Did they get it done? Or whatever it was they wanted to do. Did they build a canoe successfully? Did they manage to get the quarterly report through the board without being fired? Did they learn how to change a spoke on their bike such that when they needed to change a spoke on their bike, they did it without wrecking the wheel? Did they grow a calf and show it at the fair? Did they successfully make a sourdough bread? My wife's been on that recently. You see what I mean? Did they do the thing that they wanted to do? To me, that's success. Anything else is irrelevant. And I know we had a discussion about this the other day, and you don't necessarily agree, but that's cool. I appreciate your restraint in not saying, but they've got to know something. And I've been thinking about that a lot. And the question is, yeah, but what? What? You know, we always think there's this core of knowledge that everybody has to know, right? And the educators always go back to it. Of course, your corporate managers always go back to it, but they have to have such and such a knowledge. I wouldn't trust a doctor without such and such knowledge. But when you press on it and say, what knowledge? Actually state what it is. It's virtually impossible to do successfully. We use the example of plumbers, and I'm thinking about that, and I'm like, what is it precisely a plumber has to know to be a plumber? Is there any way to actually state what that is? And I
Yes,
think,
there is.
I don't think there is.
Well, there is. There's regulations that you must know as a plumber.
If I can speak.
You must know those regulations, otherwise you cannot get your plumbing license. You must know that.
Does that make you a plumber?
Yeah, it does. You can't be a plumber without that.
No, you can't be licensed without that.
Well, that's what we're
Not
talking
even,
about.
no,
Recognition of
not even, folks. I've written the Red Seal exam. They don't test you to memorize this knowledge. They test you to seek out knowledge. They test you to be able to find knowledge. They test you to be able to call on different networks and resources. And then they want to see if you can think critically about the knowledge you found and apply it to create safe and a functional product. That's what they test you on, not knowledge. Just
There
want
you
to
go. I don't know what the Red Seal exam is.
It's the apprenticeship national standard for the construction trades.
Oh, for construction, okay.
Apprenticeships.
Yeah. Which would include plumbers.
And plumbers and carpenters and
Yeah,
stuff.
just making that clear for Rory.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank
Stephen.
you, everyone. Bye, everyone online. Both of you. I've done broadcasts for 0 people. Doesn't bother me a bit. I just need to.
And say hi to everyone.